Assalamu alaikum and welcome all to another quick episode of the Optimized Muslim podcast. Again, I'm going to be using the screen capture app, so if you are on YouTube, then you'll be able to see the text that I'm referring to. But if you're not and you're just listening via the podcast, then it should still be okay, inshallah. So the topic for the podcast is essentially to do with a post or a couple of posts that I shared on social media a couple of weeks ago. And one quote was by Imam Ibn Jawzi and also Imam Al-Ghazali, may Allah grant them Jannah. So essentially it's to do with looking after your diet and physical fitness. And I asked the question of how many Imams in the UK currently take heed of this advice, or what would their body fat percentage be. And overall it received a positive kind of response. However, there were a couple of messages that I received that didn't necessarily agree fully with the sentiment that I expressed. So first of all, before expanding upon it, I'm just going to read the quote for those who aren't aware. So the first quote was by Imam Al-Ghazali, where he said, "Scholars used to say, who controls the desire for food will be close to God, and who bows to it will be far from him." That's the first quote. And another one is where he said, or it was said of Imam Al-Ghazali that he considered the stomach and genitals to be the dominators of our desires. If they are kept in control, all other limbs are kept in check. And this is where I asked, what is the average body fat percentage of Imams across the UK, or Muslims for that matter, but especially Imams hobbling up the mimbar? And then I move on to a quote by Imam Ibn Jawzi, where he said, "When looking for a teacher, I would make sure that he was physically fit. If he wasn't, I would not study with him. How could a person teach me to discipline myself if he can't control his diet?" So I shared this, and obviously for people who have studied Imam Al-Ghazali's work and the emphasis that he puts on food in his Ihya, and also some of the other scholars like Imam Ibn Jawzi, these are scholars from 8-9 centuries ago. This is nothing new. However, I think currently, because of in the UK we're just used to this image of Imams, and we don't seem to think it's as much of a big deal as previous scholars might have thought. And obviously, to add some nuance to the post, because obviously there's only so much that you can write on social media, and there was someone who rightly pointed out that obviously you don't necessarily know their situation, and that's all accepted, and that's all obviously part of the nuance that I was referring to in my post. There are going to be obviously people that are disciplined and that do take care of their diet, but for whatever reason, whether it's genetics or hormonal or some other illness, physically it may look like they don't take care of the diet, and that's where we obviously have to be open-minded and not judge. However, the point I was making is that in general, the point stands in that Imams or Muslims should obviously be healthy, and they should have a physical appearance that also reflects that. In general, that should be the standard. Obviously there's going to be exceptions. However, suddenly with this Imam point, some people suddenly became really nuanced, like they do on social media. I mean, if you make this point to someone in person, most people would agree with the sentiment. I have actually made the same point in person to many different people. However, online, suddenly people start coming out with all these genetic factors which apply to less than 2% of the population, according to what I've read, right? So it's either that there's a disproportionate amount of Imams within the UK that fall within that genetic condition, or we just take the benefit from the general point. And the reason why this, I feel as though this should be mentioned, is not because I like seeing physically fit Imams in the masjids necessarily. However, the point is what it represents. Imams are the leaders of the community, right? Or even, let's replace Imams with any Muslim in a position of responsibility or leadership, and to an extent we all are, whether it's just for our families or whatever group of people we lead in whichever capacity. We have to portray a certain image that lends itself towards portraying Islam in the best light possible. So part of that is obviously our physical stature and how we present ourselves, because most people, I would say that it's being overweight does not agree with the teachings of Islam in terms of how we are supposed to approach food, and also just the disciplined approach. No one can deny that Islam is a religion of discipline. It's a religion of repetition. It's a religion of kind of having a routine and having a structure, taking care over things, and obviously and embodying a level of self-control or self-mastery. So if we have people in positions of leadership that are going to inspire the next generation, then obviously I think that the da'wah that they engage in is going to be more effective if the principles that they outlay in speech is reflected in it's embodied by them, by their actions. Because I think this can become a generational problem, and also it can be an issue of inspiring the youth, or inspiring confidence, or even putting in the youth a desire to want to be leaders of the masjid or imams. And that's not going to happen if the youth cannot relate with their imams for whatever reason, whether that's to do with a language or even other things like how they speak or the language they use, or just general social and emotional intelligence. I think once I heard an American scholar say that one of the prerequisites of an imam is that they're able to carry their faith with swagga. And obviously that doesn't necessarily mean that the swagga is not referring to walking around with your trousers halfway down your pants. It's referring to a level of confidence, or it's referring to a certain kind of pride or a certain kind of self-respect that oozes through your behavior and your speech. And I think that's important, because imams should be given that status within society, and it's a different question as to why they are not, and how they're not well paid and everything else. And obviously they have a very difficult job, and oftentimes they have many different roles that they're trying to juggle as well. However, it's something that, again, looking at the future of Islam and the future generations, imams should be the beacons of a community, whereby they're afforded that level of respect and they're afforded that level of status. Nowadays what we see is that imams can barely even speak freely, because if they do, then the committee may have the good old committee might have an issue with them, and then they're always under this constant threat that their livelihood may be at risk, right? So that's another issue in terms of having this aura or image that can inspire confidence, or can inspire a certain kind of aspiration amongst the community or the youth, right? And then the third point that I was going to mention is that Muslims in general, not just imams, we should at least try to excel in permissible pursuits that are kind of Islamically aligned, but also they seem to align well with the current social kind of context or currency. And there are only a few areas like this, whereby an example would be perhaps fitness, or an example would be certain self-development ideas, psychology, or even environmental issues. These are certain areas that Muslims could be at the forefront of, rather than engaging in other things to try and get in with the culture, like TV series or movies or games, which I'm not saying they're not permissible, but obviously in terms of priorities or in terms of what is beneficial overall, I'd say those other things mentioned probably take priority over this. And then that gives you a dawah opportunity that's not being appreciated, because oftentimes people that are already engaged in certain things like self-development, they already have a mindset whereby they're open to kind of improving themselves. They're open to having these new ideas that can potentially change their life in a better way. So they're kind of prime candidates for Islamic da'wah, because they're already open to living like a contrarian in a way. They're already open to living a different kind of lifestyle, living a lifestyle with which they see benefit, whatever that might be. There's many different times that I've had conversations with people in relation to things like ketosis or intermittent fasting or long-term fasting or tracking sleep or biohacking or nootropics, so all these different kind of areas, books on psychology, and it's not directly even linked to Islam. However, it gives you an opportunity to do da'wah in your own way or in an indirect way, or even if you don't even have that in your mind, obviously as a Muslim or as a visibly practicing Muslim, you're still going to have that effect on them, on whoever you're talking to. So I think this has gone on longer than I intended, and I don't know if I made the point clearly. Just to clarify, obviously the point is not necessarily just about Imams. It was more a general point. I think any point that I mentioned applies to Muslims in general rather than just Imams, but as leaders of a community and as kind of the beacons of a community, I think they should take more responsibility. And again, if you benefit or you like these ideas or you think that these ideas would resonate with someone, then please do share it. Again, the good thing about this podcast and so far is that there's nothing that I'm selling. There's nothing like, oh, if you click the link you can join this course or anything like that. It's just an idea that I think can benefit Muslims and the way they think, and that's what this podcast is geared towards. And I appreciate your feedback, so reach out to me on social media. I'm probably most active on Instagram, but all the links will be in the description below. And Jazakallahu khairan for listening.